Good afternoon. Earlier today, I presented the budget to the House of Commons, and I'm speaking to you now, directly, to explain what this budget means for our economy and for you at home. I want to be honest with you about the problems we face and our plan to fix them. This time last year, we all began a collective national effort to constrain coronavirus, shield the vulnerable, and protect jobs and businesses. Since then, the government has announced more than £280 billion to protect people's lives and livelihoods. Our plan is working. The Independent Office for Budget Responsibility has today shown that because of interventions like the furlough, the economy is now expected to recover more quickly and fewer jobs will be lost. But we still face significant challenges. People are being told to stay at home. Businesses are still closed. It's going to take us a long time to fully recover from the damage coronavirus has done to our economy. Today's budget is a three-part plan to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people. The first part is this: we're going to keep economic support in place until well past the point that we exit lockdown. The furlough scheme, support for the self-employed, business grants, business rates holidays, tax cuts, and the temporary universal credit uplift have all been extended and generously. Taken together, this year and next, we're spending £407 billion to support people and businesses through coronavirus. I said, whatever it takes, and that means for however long it takes. But that unprecedented level of support, combined with the damage coronavirus has done, places huge strain on our public finances. Simply put, we have to get borrowing and debt back under control. So the second part of today's budget begins fixing that. Now, some people think we should ignore this problem, or worse, there are some who think there is no problem at all. But I think that's wrong. If we don't act once the economy has recovered to control our borrowing, we won't be able to fund the stronger public services people want to see. And when the next crisis comes along, we won't be able to respond with the boldness we have this time. So I want to be honest with you now, today, about how we'll begin fixing the public finances. The choice I've made is as much as I can to protect working people, small businesses, and public services. And so, while I have chosen to freeze personal tax thresholds, some of the most generous in the world, I am not going to increase the rates of income tax, national insurance, or VAT. And I am not going to find the money that we need by taking it from public services like schools or the NHS. Freezing tax thresholds is fair, asking more of those on higher incomes. And we're going to ask large businesses who have made a profit to contribute as well. 2 years from now, well past our recovery in 2023, corporation tax on company profits will increase to 25%. The United Kingdom will still have a lower corporate tax rate than the United States, Japan, Canada, France, Italy, and Germany. And we're protecting small businesses by keeping their corporation tax at the current rate of 19%. This means 7 in 10 businesses will see no tax increase at all. Only the largest, most successful companies will pay the new higher rate, and they can now plan with certainty. I know the British people don't like tax rises, nor do I. But I also know they dislike dishonesty even more. That's why I've been honest with you about the problem we have and our plan to fix it. So right now, we're going long, extending our support for people and businesses well beyond the end of lockdown. And while it is important to control borrowing and debt, those measures only take effect after the economy has recovered. But today's budget is not just about fixing problems. Today's budget is also about laying the foundations of our future economy. We're building our future economy by doing things that haven't been done before and doing them for everyone, everywhere. Our success with the vaccine has shown us this country can be a scientific superpower, leading the world through the coming technological and scientific revolutions, towards a future where growth and jobs go hand in hand with tackling climate change, where we are known around the world as the best place to invest and do business, and where we redraw the economic map with decent jobs in every corner of our country. To do that, this budget is helping people develop new skills, start an apprenticeship, and get better paid jobs. This budget is helping small business owners get the training, skills, and technology they need to compete with bigger firms and become the high-growth companies of the future. And this budget is bringing prosperity to the whole United Kingdom, with new free ports around the country and the largest pro-investment tax cut in modern British history, making the time to invest right now and the place to invest right here. So that is our budget, our plan, our numbers. But the number that in so many ways defines the last 12 months is not included in today's budget document. I want to finish my remarks by acknowledging all those who have lost their lives to coronavirus. To the family and friends left behind, your loss, felt most acutely in the quietest of moments, must be overwhelming. But I promise you, we will meet this moment with the passion and energy it demands, and we will build a fairer and more just country in their memory. Our recovery begins today. Thank you. I think we have some questions from both public and journalists, so maybe we could turn to the first question.
Chancellor, how will the new budget ensure that leaseholders aren't burdened with unfair costs associated with cladding and other historical building defects?
Ravi, hi, thank you for your question. Now, with regard to, I wonder if you're particularly impacted by this, in which case, if you are, I'm sorry, because I know this has been enormously frustrating and worrying for people. And what we did is take action a little while ago and made some announcements to help people who are dealing with unsafe cladding in their buildings. I became Chancellor a year ago. In the first budget last year, I announced an extra £1 billion. And a few weeks ago, the government announced an additional £3.5 billion, bringing the total that we will spend to £5 billion to help remediate unsafe cladding from buildings over 18 metres, which are the most unsafe. And that work is already underway, and we're getting on with that at pace. We also know there are people in other buildings who might also want to have remediation work done. So what we're doing there for those smaller buildings is providing a government-backed loan scheme which will provide low-cost government-backed loans to people, which will be capped at no more than £50 a month. So that will help provide funds to deal with those buildings. And also, we know that there have been some problems with the mortgage market and people asking for particular forms. So we're working very hard, the Housing Secretary, the Prime Minister and I, with mortgage lenders and the industry to make sure that the use of those forms, they're called EWS1 forms that have been causing the issue, the use of those forms is going to be proportionate, and we really hope that will help unblock the market together with a government insurance scheme that we're providing for people who do those assessments. So I think the combination of £5 billion of funding to remediate the most unsafe buildings, a cheap government loan to help with the rest, and these interventions on the mortgage market, when you put them all together, hopefully they will make an enormous difference and provide reassurance to people through what I know has been a difficult process. So next, if we could go, please.
Yes, hello, Chancellor. Faisal Islam.
Hi, Faisal.
Chancellor, what would you say to the, I think it's million or so people that will enter the income tax system, the million or so people that will end up in the higher rate? And when you put that together with the rise in corporation tax, this is a turning round of conservative principles. Has the pandemic fundamentally changed the conservative approach to big business, big borrowing, big taxation, and big spending?
Thanks, Faisal. Well, hopefully, both in the remarks I made earlier now and in the House of Commons earlier, people will have understood the logic of what we're trying to do. Now, obviously, the pandemic has dealt us pretty bad damage to the public finances and the economy, and I think I and the government have a responsibility to put those back in a strong position over time, but do that in a way that is supportive of our economic recovery in the short term, but also do so in a way that is fair. And I think both of the measures that we've implemented, the ones that you mentioned, pass that test. For example, the threshold freeze means that those on the lowest incomes contribute much less than those on higher incomes, and it's something that only builds over time. So it's very supportive of our recovery. And importantly, nobody's current take-home pay will be affected as a result of this policy. What this policy does is mean that in the future, any benefit that might have come from thresholds rising with inflation will not be there. And that's what will help us rebuild our public finances in a fair and honest way. And I know that's been supported by several think tanks and others who have said that's a sensible thing to do. And with regard to corporation tax, we remain a party that believes, and a government that believes in supporting business, and which is why our corporation tax, even after this change, will still be the lowest out of the G7 large economies that we compete with. So I think that's something that we will be proud to do and make sure that we support business in that way. But also, crucially, we will be exempting the vast majority of businesses, our small and medium-sized businesses, from that increase, because we want those with the biggest shoulders, just the largest, most profitable companies, to make the contribution in 2 years' time. And also, there are lots of other things in today's budget which are supportive of business, whether that's short-term support with business rates, holidays, VAT cuts, cash grants, but also new help to grow management and digital incentives, because we want to help small and medium-sized businesses get the management training they need and help them get the digital technology they need to compete in the future economy. So that, to me, when you put it all together, are the actions of a government that firmly believes in supporting business, both in the short term, but also in the long term. And the last thing I'd say, because I think it's also important, we really want businesses to invest. Well, we know that investment can help drive our recovery, and today I announced something called the super deduction, which is a tax cut for business investment, the likes of which we haven't ever seen before in this country, and that will really support businesses to invest now over the next 2 years to help drive our recovery. And I think it will make a huge difference. Next, are we going to Joel?
Hello there, Chancellor. Can you hear me okay?
I can, Joel. Fire away.
Wonderful. I want to pick up on corporation tax. The corporation tax increase is enormous. It's a 6-point jump overnight in 2 years' time. The Confederation of British Industry describes it as a worrying signal. This does feel like a gamble, doesn't it? Especially now Brexit is done. You say you want more businesses to invest in the UK. Is there a danger that this will achieve the opposite?
Well, Joel, I think that the CBI also said lots of other positive comments about the budget today, which people can read. But you talk about the corporation tax rate again, and you talk about international competitiveness and the signal it sends. We will still have a lower corporation tax rate than any of our major G7 competitors. So America, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, for example. And so I think that puts us in very good stead internationally. And if you broaden that group of large economies out to another group called the G20, with the 20 largest economies in the world, we would still have the 5th lowest rate in that group. So I think on any measure, it's still an internationally competitive rate that signals that Britain is open for business and supportive of business. And as I was saying to Faisal, the super deduction, the tax cut for business that we've put in place over the next 2 years to support the recovery, to drive up business investment in new factories, new machines across the country, that's an enormous tax cut for business. I think it's the biggest business tax cut that I think we've ever seen in British history as far as we can calculate. But I think that shows we're on the side of business and we know they can help play their part in the recovery. But I also think it's reasonable, given the amount of support that we've given business, given the crisis we face with our public finances, that it's reasonable to ask those largest, most successful companies in 2 years' time to contribute something back to help us rebuild. I think that's a reasonable and fair approach that will support us in the long term, but it's reasonable in the long term as well. I think next are we going to Ed?
Yes, hello. Hi, Chancellor. Ed Conway from Sky News. Can you hear me?
I can.
Behind me, we've got a chart that we've been looking at a lot today at Sky News, showing you tax as a percentage of GDP, basically the tax burden in the UK. And I suppose my question is, looking at this chart and looking at how high the tax burden is getting towards the end of the forecast horizon, are you concerned about being the Chancellor with the highest tax burden of any chancellor going all the way back to the 1960s and Roy Jenkins? Does that concern you at all?
Well, Ed, I guess what your chart doesn't show is all the other chancellors, if any of them have had pandemics to deal with. We haven't had a pandemic like this in over 100 years. And so I think that's why we're having this conversation. That's the problem that we're grappling with. And unsurprisingly, when you've had a shock like that, and then when you've had a response in the likes of which we've done. I don't think any of those other chancellors probably have ever had to do as much fiscal support for the country as I have had to. I think it's reasonable to expect that what we have to do in response to all of those things is going to be a bit different to what's happened in the past. But what I would say is, what are we doing? What are we doing with those taxes? What we're doing is funding strong public services. People elected us because we told them we were the party of public services. We were going to invest in the NHS, in schools, and we were also going to invest in projects across the country to level up opportunity. That's what we want to get on and deliver during this Parliament. And we also want to be responsible with the public finances for the reasons I set out. And it's because of those reasons that I've taken the 2 decisions I've made today. And I do believe they are the right decisions for the country and for the economy. Next, we're going to Helia.
Okay, that's it.
Good afternoon, Chancellor. The OBR points out that in your calculations, there's no provision for virus-related costs beyond next year, despite the fact that the government acknowledges that there will be an annual vaccination programme, there'll be further costs associated with test and trace, as well as, of course, the NHS increased costs because of cancelled operations and procedures. You've made a lot today about wanting to be honest with people. Do you think is it your honest judgment today that the pandemic will cost nothing from next year?
Well, Helia, on public spending, you're right to differentiate between the general plans we have, which I can go through in a second, and then also the plans for coronavirus. And it's right to think about those things differently. Now, obviously, at this moment, we don't know exactly the future path of what's going to happen. But what we do know is that this year, there's an enormous amount of call for extra funding for coronavirus, which is why today I announced £1.6 billion of extra funding, for example, for the vaccination programme to make sure that we can get that all the resources it needs to happen as quickly as possible, provide for potential booster shots, but also to improve our preparedness for future pandemics. So some of the things we're doing is to build that capacity to react quickly in the future. So I don't have a crystal ball about next year, but we are thinking about the next 12 months and what's required. You talked about NHS backlog. At the spending review in November, we announced billions of pounds of extra funding for the NHS, both for diagnostic equipment to upgrade some of the older diagnostic equipment and to provide more ability for the NHS to do elective surgery this year to start catching up on some of the backlog that we know exists. But to your broader question about public services and public spending, the numbers that are set out today show that there will be strong growth, strong investment in public services, not just over these 2 years, but for the remainder of the Parliament as well. And then next, I think Catherine Sampson.
Yes, thank you, Chancellor. Just your reaction, please, to 2 points. First of all, Scotland's Finance Secretary claims you've not matched her ambition for supporting economic recovery and jobs, and she's especially disappointed you didn't make that uplift to universal credit permanent. Just your reaction to that. And secondly, your business minister suggested in an interview yesterday, when it came to an independence referendum, it was up to the Scottish people to decide when and whether they want one. Do you agree with him? And is the Treasury planning some change of strategy here?
Well, Catherine, I genuinely believe that I don't think people want any of us to be focusing on constitutional questions at the moment. I think what people want is us to be focusing on our response to the pandemic, making sure that we get the vaccine rolled out as quickly as we can into as many people's arms as possible. And then with that, with the Prime Minister's roadmap, cautiously and safely reopen our economy, get our lives back to normal and try and protect as many jobs as possible. I think that's actually what people want us to focus on, which is what we're getting on and doing. With regard to the universal credit uplift, I announced today that we are extending that for 6 months. This was something that we put in place temporarily at the beginning of the pandemic when we were in lockdown. And the 6 months extension means that it will be in place well beyond the end of this current lockdown. And it only forms one part of our response to helping those on low incomes or those who are vulnerable. There's lots of other things we're doing, helping people with their council tax bills, with their rental payments through something called local housing allowance. But crucially, the best way to help people over time is to give them the skills they need to get great jobs or get better jobs, which is why we've increased the national living wage next year above inflation, which means a £350 pay rise for those on low incomes. And we're also, with the Prime Minister's lifetime skills guarantee, for example, giving every adult the opportunity to go and get a government-funded qualification at a good standard, which will help them increase their prospects of getting a job or getting a new job. And they're doing lots of other things to encourage companies to hire people. For example, our Kickstart scheme for young people, or indeed the £3,000 that we're paying companies to take on a new apprentice. So there's lots of different ways to help people. The figures and the facts in the document today show that those on the lowest incomes have been supported the most by all the interventions that we've put in place over the last 12 months. So I'm proud of that. That is this government acting to protect those who really need our help. But as the economy reopens, it's right that we transition our support to focusing on people, getting them into work, getting them the skills they need, and that's what this budget delivers. Next, I think we're going over to the Times. And Philip Aldrich. Philip, are you there?
Yes. Hi, Chancellor. On corporation tax, you're undoing 10 years of tax policy by raising corporation tax up to 25% in 2023, and you're even reintroducing a small business tax rate. So I just wondered, was the previous policy wrong? And also, what gives you confidence that your tax rises are not going to choke off the recovery in 2023? There's still spare capacity under the OBR's forecasts, right at the end of the forecast period. So it looks like there's more to go for in terms of growth.
Thanks, Phil. I mean, I think it's not right to judge decisions that were made over the last 10 years by the fact that today we're dealing with the results of a hopefully once in a century pandemic that we're grappling with. The decisions that were made in the past were right for then, and we're making the right decisions for now. I think with corporation tax, over time, what's transpired is it might not be the most effective way to drive capital investment up, which is what we want to see, because we want businesses to invest to create jobs in new machinery to drive up productivity. And we think our super deduction hopefully will do a better job of that over the next 2 years. And I think we'll hopefully see the results of that. And then with regard to your second question, we need obviously to be sensitive about the timing of this to make sure that we do support the recovery in the short term. The super deduction obviously does that. The corporation tax increase doesn't come for 2 years, which is past the point that the OBR expect our GDP to have recovered its pre-crisis level, which actually is next year, in the second quarter of next year. The Bank of England happen to think that will happen a bit earlier than that even. And your point on spare capacity, you'll know that is the output gap, which I think is what you're referring to, is a notoriously difficult thing for economists to estimate with any precision. But even on the OBR's forecast, the bulk of that gap is closed over the next 12 to 18 months. And then what's left over the residual period is, I think, 0.1% from memory. But I think broadly we can safely believe that the economy will have recovered, and that is a safe time for the increase to happen. But in the proportionate way that it is, not affecting small businesses. And remember, corporation tax is a tax on profits. So by definition, it's only those companies who are doing well, making profits, that pay it. So we're going over to the FT. George, are you there? Hi, George.
I am. Thank you, Chancellor. Can I ask you a bit about your flagship Levelling Up programme? We were looking at your £1 billion towns fund you've announced today. By our reckoning, 40 of the 45 towns on the list are represented by Conservative MPs. We're also looking at the Levelling Up Fund that you've announced, and you've come up with some priority areas. I noticed that your constituency, Richmond Shire, is in priority area 1, whereas places like Barnsley, Bolsover, Salford are in priority area 2. I just wondered if you could give us any reassurance that you're using fair criteria to assess the eligibility of these areas, or whether this looks a little bit like naked pork barrel politics.
Thanks, George. So the formula for the grant payments for the new fund to give them some capacity funding to bid for projects is based on an index of economic need, which is transparently published, I think, actually by MHCLG, and based on a bunch of objective measures. So that will be there for people to have a look at. And remember, that's only areas that have received some capacity funding to bid. No area is excluded for bidding. It's just that those areas, on the basis of this formula, might need a bit of extra help. So we're giving those local areas some money to put their bid together to help them. And to your broader point, I think if you look at all the things we're doing, they're benefiting people in every corner of the country. So we, for example, announced the location of our 8 free ports in England today. They're spread in 8 English regions, from Southampton to Teesside to Liverpool, across the country. And all of those areas are actually represented by a mix of both MPs and local authorities. Because what we're interested in is making sure that wherever you grow up, wherever you happen to live, that this government is helping to provide opportunity for you and creating jobs in your area. And I firmly believe that whether it's the Levelling Up Fund or our Free Ports Initiative or any of the other things we're doing, we are delivering and making good on that promise. Next, we're going to Graham from the Daily Mirror. Graham, are you there?
I am. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Hi, Graham.
Chancellor,
good evening.
Hello, good afternoon. Chancellor, are you prepared to extend still further the cut-off date for the renewed support that you've announced today if, while no one wants this, the timing for the roadmap has to change? And then secondly, if I may, what do you say to those who have labelled it an insult that there's no pay rise for many thousands of public sector workers who've been on the front line during the pandemic? There's been no pay rise announced by you today.
Graham, to your first point, what we've done very deliberately is extend all of our support well beyond the end of the roadmap, which, the Prime Minister set out some dates in April, March, April, May, and then finally June. For example, look at furlough, which is being extended all the way to September, in line with many other things. The reason we've taken that approach is, as I said in the House of Commons today, is because we want to make sure that we've made allowance for even the most cautious possible interpretation of the roadmap or what might happen. So we've done that in advance to provide people with that certainty up front. So I think we're well protected on that, and that I think has been met broadly well today by stakeholders. To your second point on public sector pay, this was something that I addressed in the spending review back in November when we talked about pay for the next year. And back then what I said, which I'm happy to go over now, is when I was looking at all the numbers, what we saw was in the private sector, wages were falling, people were having their hours cut, many of them were furloughed, and sadly almost 750,000 people in the private sector had lost their jobs. And almost none of those things had happened in the public sector. So given that, and given the obviously very difficult fiscal situation that we face, that we've been talking about, I thought for reasons of fairness and also to try and protect those public sector jobs, it was reasonable to take a more targeted approach to public sector pay for this next year. So what does that mean? That means those who work in the NHS, 1 million people, it's about a quarter of all people in the public sector, they will receive a pay rise next year, and we're all very grateful to them for the fantastic work that they are doing under difficult conditions. But for everyone else, there will be a pause on pay increases this year. But that doesn't mean nothing. It means if your pay would normally have progression built into it, as many contracts do, that will still happen, and that's worth about 1%. And then the extra protection we did for those in the public sector was if you earn less than about £24,500 from memory, about the median salary of someone in the UK, your pay will also go up by a fixed £250 or 1%. And if you take all of that together, what that means is a majority of people in the public sector will see their pay increase next year. So for the reasons I've set out, I think that is a fair and proportionate approach to public sector pay in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And lastly, I think we are going over to Ben from the Daily Telegraph. Good evening, Ben.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Chancellor?
I can now.
Fantastic. 2 quick questions. Firstly, can you rule out an increase in the rate of capital gains tax this Parliament? And secondly, there's early data that suggests the COVID vaccine is having a real impact on the pandemic, a positive impact, quicker than the models suggested. Do you think we should be open to possibly pulling forward some of the reopening roadmap dates if the data says it's safe to do that?
Thanks, Ben. Well, I always, and people are probably tired of hearing me say this if they've been watching me on the telly in the recent week, but I obviously can't comment on fiscal policy other than on the ones that we're talking about in the budget. So I can't answer your first question, but I think we've made the decisions we've made on tax. And as we said in our manifesto, we didn't want to raise the rates of income tax, national insurance and VAT, and we have stuck by that because that is important to me to do that. And with regard to your second question, look, the Prime Minister, when he set out the roadmap, said that what we were trying to do was for it to be cautious but irreversible, and that's the right approach. And the dates that we've set out were always the earliest of dates. We are making, and that's the way they will remain, but it's a good note for us to finish on, and I think it just to say incredible congratulations and thanks to everyone involved with the vaccine rollout. It's been something that all of us in the country, I think, can feel hugely proud of, from the team that developed the vaccine in Oxford, whether it's Professor Sarah Gilbert and her team, all the way to the volunteers who are now helping get it into people's arms and shepherding them through all our vaccine centres. An unbelievable rate, faster than almost any other country in the world. What a success story, what a thing for us to be so proud of, and a great advert of what we can be in the future. We can be, as I talked about in the speech, a scientific superpower where we're developing new medicines, new therapeutics. We can create new companies out of that, create new jobs, and spread that employment around the country and save people's lives in the process. I think it's shown us what we're capable of, a country, and we want to harness that spirit as we look forward and build a brighter future for the country as we emerge from this pandemic. And I'm very confident that today's budget sets us on the road to doing exactly that. Thank you, Ben. And thank you very much, everyone. Good evening.
Da oggi c'è una soluzione facile e completa. In un'unica piattaforma puoi trovare news, informazioni, comunicazioni istituzionali, locali e nightlife, shopping e delivery, eventi e guide turistiche, ticket e molto altro ancora. Disponibile per smartphone, tablet e PC. 1000 soluzioni, un'unica piattaforma. COMPLITALY.